Welcome to another episode of EQ Unlocked, where we talk about emotional intelligence and nervous system regulation. Today, we're going to talk about something that most people would really rather avoid. And so, a lot of people think relationships fall apart because people stop loving each other. But many times, relationships of all sorts break down because people stop being honest with themselves first. Self-betrayal creates disconnection long before separation ever happens. And so selfishness, self-betrayal, and the disconnection it creates. So when people continuously abandon their own needs, their boundaries, their truth or integrity to avoid that conflict, rejection, guilt, or loneliness, they disconnect from themselves. And once we disconnect from ourselves, resentment grows, emotional exhaustion grows, emotional safety disappears, relationships become performance rather than. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's get into it. What is self betrayal? Well, it can be super simple or it can be a little bit more complex. It can be saying yes when you mean no. It can be staying silent to avoid discomfort, ignoring your own needs repeatedly, pretending to be okay when you're not, choosing temporary peace over truth. And every time you betray yourself, you're training your nervous system, and your nervous system remembers that betrayal. And so, you know, this happens continuously to some folks. And there have been times in my life where it's happened a multitude of times with me. I would just kind of fall in line because I valued that relationship more than my own peace. I valued that idea of what I was building more than what I already had. And again, this led to anger and frustration and resentment. But the truth of the matter is that it led to resentment in myself and towards myself. And that was the bigger problem. And so people become selfish. People become selfish because you know, they become selfish because we like to justify and we like to rationalize our behaviors and what's all happening. And so there is a huge difference between healthy self-protection and selfishness rooted in survival. And so we have to kind of break these things down because in any relationship, I don't care if you're talking about a relationship with your children, a relationship at work, a relationship at, a romantic relationship, marriage, whatever. There, there is a healthy part of you that is willing to compromise. There's a healthy part of us that can look at the situation and say, okay, well, you know what? I'm not 100% right. As a matter of fact, my motto kind of is, if I'm 100% right about anything, I'm already wrong because there's always more nuances than what we want to give credit to. And so selfishness, I guess, in my opinion, it 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 comes from a place of a lack of understanding. It comes from fear. It comes from us trying to regulate our nervous system. So sometimes it happens because people are dysregulated. People feel emotionally unsafe. They're afraid of losing control. They're operating from a mindset of scarcity, or they're trying to avoid pain. And as we've talked about on the show a countless amount of times, when survival takes over, empathy decreases, connection it weakens, and people begin protecting themselves at all cost, never realizing that so-called protection is actually costing them much more than what they're protecting. Survival mode, it makes connection difficult because protection becomes more important than presence. And if you're not present in a relationship and you're always on guard, well, that's a very surface level interaction. And it has to be. And so, just to give some examples, right? in past relationships, right? So after my first marriage, it was such calamity of epic proportions. I I was stuck in this place of protection like no other, self-protection. I stayed disconnected from anybody I met, anybody I interacted with. I stayed disconnected from them, especially romantically speaking. I would not let feelings get involved. I would not engage in meaningful, lasting ways because that relationship, because of my own self-betrayal and because of the things I allowed to happen, really, really destroyed who I was. And it wasn't just the marriage. There were a lot of things at that time period in my life that destroyed who I was. And so I mentioned this before, but my repressed memories of my childhood abuse came back literally 6 months, 7 months before my daughter was born. And when that happened, my entire world collapsed. Now, by this point, the abuse in my marriage had already started. The the my self-worth was at an all-time low before the memories came back. You know, my ex-wife had made the habit of hitting me and punching me and putting me down and so that really destroyed my self-image of who I was as a man. And that created a lot of internal conflict. And so once the abuse came back, it was a complete collapse. Or excuse me, not the abuse, but once the memories of my childhood abuse came back, my complete world collapsed. So in this time, everything that I ever knew meant absolutely nothing. Not my God, not my family, not because everything was a lie. In my mind, at that point, my entire foundation was a lie. And once you find out your foundation is a lie, well, then how can you build from there? Couple that with the what was going on in my marriage prior to and after, and I became very, very guarded, which meant I was incredibly, incredibly selfish. And so the selfishness, it became very much a part of who I was, not because I was trying to be selfish, but because survival mode makes connection difficult, because protection becomes more important than presence, as I just said. And so, with that being said, my entire world was built on survival. And when your entire world is built on survival, well, what do? You survive. And so the disconnection really began to a much greater degree. And so, as I mentioned earlier, this just isn't about relationships. This is about friendships. This is about workplace connections. This is about all of these things. And so, what does it look like? It looks like one person gives and overgives. The other person takes, needs to stop being communicated honestly, and honestly being the operative word. Resentment builds silently, and everybody involved stops feeling seen. And so, in my case, this disconnection from my world, it happened overnight. It was literally one day I was this person, the next day I was somebody very, very different. And so, but most of the time, disconnection happens over a period of time. It happens through repeated avoidance, unresolved hurt, emotional inconsistency, lack of accountability, and a nervous system stuck in defense mode. And so, as that happens, think about what that would look like, right? In a relationship or think about it from an employer employee standpoint, right? Let's say you go to work and you go to HR and you say, "Oh, I'm having this problem. This problem of, well, I have a supervisor who is, you know, treating me unfairly." And let's say the HR looks at the situation and they have a conversation with you and they say, "Well, this situation, it does seem unfair on the surface, but let's go ahead and look into it and see what more is to it." And they look into it and then they come back and determine, well, you know what, your supervisor was unfair here in this section of the problem. But on this section, well, you kind of didn't show up to work, so this write-up is legitimate, right? So they analyze that. They analyze that situation. They sit down and take time to talk to you about it, and you understand the entire situation, the entire scenario, and they validate your feelings. But what happens? Then your appreciation for that workplace is likely going to improve, right? Even if they don't give you the news you want, they were honest with you. They addressed your needs, the situation. And so that same thing happens in relationships when, you know, there's avoidance in conversations that you feel like you need to have, and somebody avoids it. Well, that disconnection grows. When, somebody avoids you or avoids talking about things that are uncomfortable, that disconnection grows because why? You don't feel heard. You don't feel seen. You don't feel like you exist. And that's if you're willing to have those conversations. But what if you're not even willing to have those conversations? Well, then that disconnect grows inside you or us, and we start to build resentment toward that other person. Because the mind is amazing at many different things. But the one thing that I've found that the human brain is better at than anything is lying to us. We can make a story up out of thin air on nothing other than just, simple thought that jumps in our mind. We can create a whole scenario out of absolutely nothing. And I'm sure you've done this before. I'm sure that everybody listening to this has gotten a text message and it felt a little bit off, right? And when it felt a little bit off, we were like, oh, well, that's strange. That person didn't respond the way I wanted them to. And our mind automatically creates a story around why that person didn't respond in the way we wanted, how we wanted, when we wanted. And depending on your experience with that person, that story could get out of hand real quick, right? And all of that was made up in your mind. And when that was made up in your mind, you start developing feelings around that situation, right? And so that's the problem, that the mind will lie to you, not because it's beneficial, not because it's helpful, because its job is to keep you alive. And so truth doesn't really play into keeping you alive sometimes. That's just reality. And so how do we go about this, right? How do we move forward from how disconnection happens to what's next? Well, we have to kind of acknowledge what's next. And for me, that was accountability without shame. And this part really mattered. See, I had to recognize my selfish behaviors without hating myself. I had to take responsibility without collapsing into shame. I had to learn to reconnect with the truth and with integrity. And so what does this look like? I started taking time to examine different parts of my life. And I started taking time to be really honest with myself. And at times that was hurtful. At times I would have rather done anything except for be honest with myself, especially the times where I messed up, especially the times where I hurt people I cared about or abandoned myself or wasn't the stellar human being I thought myself to be. Right. And that's hard. That's hard enough as it is. But to do it without shame, well, that was a little bit more challenging because yes, I could acknowledge the truth privately, but there were some truths I just couldn't acknowledge privately. You know, looking at my relationships and looking at the people I had done wrong throughout the years. And there were a lot of people, and I don't want to pretend that there weren't, right? But I had to own it because I knew that owning it was the only way that I was going to move forward. Owning it was the only way that I was going to make my life better. For me, I had to really understand and recognize that accountability is not about punishment. It's about reconnection. And again, for me, it was reconnection with myself. And so what did that do? Well, when I got honest with myself, then I could start looking around me and seeing that all these people who had hurt me, they probably had their own story. And they probably went through some things and they probably had some experiences that led them to the behaviors that hurt me so bad. Does it justify it? Does it rational, does it make it okay? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. However, it does give me a window of insight. And it definitely gives me a door to walk through to seek forgiveness toward them. And that opened up freedom inside me that I can't really describe. And so I always talk about regulation, awareness, and choice, right? And this is no exception to that rule. This self-betrayal, this honesty, this connection, right? This is all, it had, regulation had to come first. And as I became, you know, more aware, after I was regulated, I began making different choices. And so what did that regulation look like? Well, it looked like whatever needed to be done. And so what does that mean? And you know, I can remember a time where I was thinking about somebody very special in my life that this whole situation had taken away from me in my mind. And I was hurt, and I was really, really hurt. And I I sat there and I realized that as much as I cared about this person, that I wasn't the human being that I wanted to be when I met her. I wasn't. And so had I been the human being that I wanted to be when I met her, well, then things probably would have worked out differently. Actually, I know they would have worked out differently. And so when I had to face that realization, right? When I finally sat down and got real with myself about not being the man that I wanted to be at that point in my life, it hit me. It hit me to my core in a way that I can't even describe. And so when that, right around these thoughts started coming up, and I started really addressing them. I had just moved into a new place, and I'll never forget it. I walked into what was going to be my bedroom in my new home, and there was no furniture, and just carpet. You know, no work had been done, nothing had been painted. And I sat there in the middle of the floor, and I had opened up some paint and started painting the walls. And as I'm painting the walls, the smell from the paint reminded me and triggered the smell of paint in the home that I shared with her. And once that smell hit, an emotional flood just took over. And I laid there. I laid there in the middle of the floor, literally sobbing, not at just my loss, not at just losing this person that I love, but at my own, at my own self-betrayal, at the lies I had told myself. And I laid there and I laid there and I laid there. It was probably, I would say, probably an hour. And then I fell asleep. And then I woke up and I realized that I was a part of the problem. And so I became more determined to become the man that I wanted to become so many years ago. Right? So that regulation piece, that crying, that breathing, that just letting things happen, that led me to a regulated state. And because I had already understood what the problem was, well, then I had some awareness about the choices that I needed to make. See, without regulation, people react, they defend, they withdraw, they attack, they avoid the truth. And all those things are just detrimental. Have you ever been attacked? Have you ever just had somebody react to you? Have you ever had somebody just be defensive or withdraw or avoid the truth because, wow, that's uncomfortable? I tell you, my friends, I'll tell you that there's absolutely nothing more challenging than having a conversation. Well, that's not true. There's lots of things more challenging, but that's a very challenging thing to do is have a conversation with somebody who's not regulated. And for so long, I was the person who wasn't regulated, right? And so as I grew, as I developed, I started having very difficult conversations being regulated. And what I noticed is that I could pause. I could communicate honestly. I could tolerate discomfort. I could stay connected during very, very hard conversations. But I had to be regulated first. And so again, I talk about regulation, but what is it? It's the ability to just simply breathe through a moment. And I know for a fact that there's somebody who's going to listen to this. And they're going to say, oh, I don't breathe. That's that woo-saw stuff. That's that craziness. I ain't doing all that, which I get. I completely get, because in our country, in this culture, we think about breathing as some, woo, 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 like, oh, that's silly. It's just breathing. But my friends, that's the lie we've been told. Without breath, life doesn't exist. Period. Point blank. Doesn't it make sense that breathing could possibly play a very key part of living? And so breathing is actually how I started this whole process. It's how I started everything. And now I got better at it as time went on. And then I found out some other tools and techniques, right, that I could use and to regulate myself and to just be present. And once I did that, then I could navigate the world around me with a lot more presence than I ever had the capabilities to do before. I could be present for conversations. As I'm sitting here talking to you right now, I don't even know where my phone is at. If you knew me, you would never suspect in a million years that I would not know where my phone was at and would be doing anything else other than looking for my phone, right? There was a point where I had a couple different phones and had them on all the time. But that was my attempt to control my world so that I felt safe. That was my attempt to control the things that are happening around me so I could feel safe. And I didn't even realize it. And as a matter of fact, without regulation, I wouldn't have felt safe. Or I'm sorry, without regulation, I would have never even recognized that as simply an effort for me to feel safe. And so I want you to be honest with yourselves. And I want you to really have a conversation with yourself about, let's get really honest. Let's get really honest with ourselves. Okay? Ask yourself just a couple questions. Where am I abandoning myself? Where am I not being honest with myself at? Where have I betrayed myself? Right? Because when we ask ourselves these questions, we can get to a point where we can have better relationships, where we can create regulation, where we can get out of survival mode. And you deserve to be out of survival mode. You deserve to live. You deserve to live a happy life. You deserve to have peace and to be in love and to enjoy life and to actually live. And that's something you're not doing when you're in survival mode. So the strongest relationships are not built on perfection. They're built on honesty. They're built on accountability. They're built on regulation. They're built on repair. And if you continuously betray yourself to keep something going, eventually you lose both the relationship and yourself. If you want to understand more about your patterns, reactions, and baseline more clearly, start with the regulation baseline assessment at matthewfstevens.com/find your regulation baseline. The link is at the bottom of this description. I truly appreciate you guys being here. As always, I appreciate the love, the support. I appreciate you guys sharing episodes, liking episodes, commenting. I appreciate it. If you have emailed me, I promise you I'm getting back to you. The mailbox is being inundated with people reaching out. And I appreciate that. I appreciate so much. But obviously, time is limited. So I promise you I'll get back to you. It's just going to be a matter of time. So, as always, be amazing. Be you.
As this episode comes to a close, take a moment to notice what stood out for you. Emotional intelligence isn't about having all the answers. It's about building awareness, understanding yourself and the people around you, and choosing how you respond, especially when things feel difficult. Growth happens through reflection and practice, not pressure or perfection. If this conversation supported you, consider sharing it with someone who may benefit from it as well. To explore more tools and resources around emotional intelligence and personal development, connect with EQ Unlocked and Nulls. Until next time, remember, better awareness leads to better choices, and better choices lead to a better life. This is EQ Unlocked.